Please pray with me. Jesus, you are the stone the builders rejected, but you have become the cornerstone of a kingdom that has been changing the world for centuries. When our lives feel shaken, may we find a firm place to stand in you. Let your word and the authority by which you teach anchor us to yourself so that we might find life to the fullest. Amen. The other week, I experienced a bit of a nightmare scenario that some of you might be familiar with if you have an air conditioning unit. I looked out the kitchen window and I saw that our fan, the unit outside, was covered in a thin layer of ice, and there was steam coming out of the vents. I was like, are you kidding me? Now, we had just had this repairman come and fix it up in December. And so I gave them a call and I was like, hey, we've got some ice on the unit, there's steam coming out. And they're like, well, you're past the 30-day warranty, so whatever repairs have to happen now, it's going to have to come out of pocket. And so we scheduled a repairman to come, and we're waiting a couple days, and I'm just on pins and needles, like, we just paid to have it fixed. Now somebody's got to come. It's an old unit. Are they going to have to do the whole thing? Like, I have no idea how much this is going to cost, and it's an AC unit. I went to seminary. I don't know how to fix these things. I could watch as many YouTube videos as possible and have no clue what I'm doing. This is well outside of my area. And so eventually the man came and he showed up at the door. And I was talking to him. He was asking me some questions. And I showed him some pictures that I'd taken and some videos of the unit trying to operate. And he said, look, everything is just fine. This kind of thing happens all the time in the winter. If you still got hot air coming through your vents, it's not an issue. This is just something that happens. Everything is operating perfectly, normally. We're not even going to bill you for the visit, for the stop by today. And my anxiety just went way down. And the reason it went down is because he spoke with authority. This is a guy who knew AC units. This is a guy who knew this area. This is a guy who knew what was needed, when things were wrong, when things were fine. This was his area of authority. This was his domain. When any of us find ourselves in those sort of situations, anxious, like we're in over our heads, like there's something wrong and we don't know how to fix it, when there could be potentially serious trouble coming down the road, we look for these voices of authority. And when we hear these voices of authority speak into the problems of our lives, our anxiety goes down. When somebody who is trusted and capable, somebody who's knowledgeable, somebody who has expertise and experience in this domain, when somebody with that kind of authority can speak about a situation that you're going through, it's calming, it's peaceful, it brings some harmony and tranquility where before there was anxiety and worry. This is how Jesus has been speaking throughout the Sermon on the Mount. As we come to the end of this series we've been going through, as we've heard Jesus teach on all sorts of different things, it says here at the very end of the chapter that the crowds were amazed. Or another way to translate the Greek there is dumbfounded, because Jesus was speaking as one with authority, not just as the scribes or the teachers of the law who might read from the book, but Jesus was somebody speaking with authority, somebody who spoke with authority over all of these different domains of life, not over just one sort of thing. He was speaking with authority on matters of prayer and scripture, but also matters of money, matters of marriage and family, matters of how to get along with your neighbor. Jesus was speaking about all of these things with an authority that people had never heard before. And so this morning, as we go through this chapter, as we look at the stories that Jesus told, I want us to do something a little bit different. I want us to work through it backwards, beginning with the end, which talked about Jesus and his authority and the people being amazed by his authority, and then working back to the parable that he told of the two builders, one who built on sand and one who built on rock. And so to begin with, let's look at what Jesus was saying about authority, or I guess what was said about Jesus and his authority that people recognized. If we look around in our culture today, it's harder and harder to find a trusted figure of authority that everybody can agree on, that this person is indeed the authority. And I think the reason for this, I think we can blame this one on the French, as you can with many things. No, I'm just kidding. I love the French. But particularly two French philosophers from the postmodern tradition, Jean-Francois Lyotard and Jacques Derrida. And before you think that this is going into a philosophy lecture here, we're going to just keep it very brief and just touch on these guys a little bit. But when it comes to authority, Lyotard wrote about how the authority of older institutions were losing their legitimacy. And I think he was onto something. He was somebody who was writing around the 50s, 60s, 70s, and he was writing as someone who had just seen the world go through this horribly tumultuous period of World War I, followed by a Great Depression, followed by World War II, and the discovery of these horrific death camps. And the world had just gone through, it had just been turned upside down by all of these things. And Lyotard was a writer and a thinker and a philosopher who looked back and said, you know what? All of these institutions that people put their trust in for a long time, that they were looked at as authorities, they told these great stories about how they were all going to make the world a better place. You know, that was the story that the government was telling to its people, that we're going to make the world a better place. It's the story that the church was telling its people, we're going to make the world a better place. As new inventions and technology and businesses grew, they all had the same meta-narrative, is what he called it, the same story, that by progress, by our story that we're telling, the world is going to become a better place. And he took a moment to pause and ask, look at what just happened in our world. Because of these institutions, because of these people who had authority, the world didn't become a better place. The world nearly tore itself to pieces. And so as a result, instead of giving authority to these institutions and these people, he proposed that instead, authority should be taken from an external source, like a community or a government or a church or an academy or things like that. That authority should no longer reside outside of you, but authority should belong inside of you. That these meta-narratives, these grand stories, have led to destruction, and they should be left behind. You know, this is something that we should leave behind as individuals and find rather authority within ourselves. That each person should be telling their own story rather than living the story of a higher authority. That now, instead of placing authority or legitimacy in these external institutions like schools and churches and governing bodies and businesses, that each person should be their own individual authority over themselves, self-autonomy. You know, it's a thing that we've lived with for a long time. This message was very new in the 60s and 70s, but you may look around and see how far it has spread and how it's very much a fabric of our society today. Now the other fella, Derrida, instead of talking about how or what was going on with authority being moved from external sources to internal, he wrote about how this was happening through this process called deconstruction. It's a term you might have heard before. He's sort of the one who coined it, even though he refused to give a definition for it. We see throughout his writings as he's talking about deconstruction that sort of what he's pointing at is the process of moving authority from something external to internal begins with questioning and breaking down the stories that these institutions have told, that these authorities have told, by questioning them, by breaking them down, by always asking, what's their agenda? You know, these things aren't necessarily looking out for you. They've got an agenda of their own. And in order to you to really live your fullest life, you need to take back your authority. You need to deconstruct these authority figures, deconstruct the stories that they've told you, so that you can then reconstruct your life on your own authority, in the way that you want, so that you can write your life story in the way that you want, rather than being caught up in the story that somebody else is trying to tell. Now, since he didn't really give a definition, it's hard to really pinpoint exactly what somebody like Derrida was talking about. But there was a theologian named Kevin Van Hooser who wrote a little bit on this topic, and I think what he writes shares a little bit of wisdom for us. He wrote that the motive behind Derrida's strategy of deconstruction stems from his alarm over illegitimate appeals to authority and exercises of power. The belief that one has reached the single correct meaning, or God, or truth, provides a wonderful excuse for damning those whom one disagrees with as either fools or heretics. So what he's saying is that anybody who believes they've reached the ultimate story, the ultimate truth, it's simply a way for them to write off the people they disagree with. It's a way for them to have more power in the world. He goes on writing that neither priests who supposedly speak for God, nor philosophers who supposedly speak for reason, should be trusted. Any claim that tries to speak from a position of authority should be critically examined and deconstructed. He's writing that any external authority and the stories that they tell should be critically examined, broken apart, so that you, as the internal self-appointed authority over your life, can begin to build a new life in the way that you want. This is sort of the mindset that's come out of these two French philosophers that we see impacting our society in a lot of ways today. We might not even think about these things very much because they've very much worked their way into our own culture subconscious. So now you might be asking, what on earth does this have to do with what Jesus was talking about? Two things I want to point out for us today. One is that when Jesus is mentioned as someone with authority, that's a very difficult message for us to hear. Jesus didn't really beat around the bush when he talked about his own authority. Towards the end of the book of Matthew, as Jesus is giving this great commission to his disciples, he starts by saying, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." And this is not a mild or subtle claim. He's saying that all authority belongs to me. Now, for those of us who have absorbed this message, that we are supposed to be the ultimate authority in our lives, when we hear Jesus saying something like that, or when we hear what's said about him at the end of this chapter that we read this morning, it just makes us bristle. It rubs against everything that we've learned or that we've been taught, that we are supposed to be the ultimate authority. But yet here, when these people look at Jesus and they're dumbfounded by the authority with which he speaks, or when he says about himself that all authority belongs to me, it immediately puts us in a bind. It means that if we are going to be someone who follows Jesus, it means that eventually down the road, or possibly even right now, I am going to be asked to step down from my position of authority and look at him as somebody over me, somebody with authority. That's a terrifying thing for many people to even consider giving up. This idea that I won't be the highest authority in my life anymore. You know, that's a scary thing for us to consider now, but it's also something that people heard in Jesus' time and they walked away because of it. It was a hard thing to believe then, it's a hard thing to believe now. To take a step down from being the ultimate authority, who gets to have the final say over our lives, and giving that up. Jesus spoke as one with authority. Another reason that I think Jesus' teaching connects with what we were talking about with these philosophers is because it points to the parable that Jesus was talking about building on rock and building on sand. Because I think if you pause for a moment and look, if you deconstruct a rock, all you're left with is sand. Sand is nothing more than just a deconstructed rock. And these are the two foundations that Jesus was talking about. That the wise build upon this rock, and that the foolish build upon this sand, and when the rains come, when the winds blow, when the floods rise, the sandy ground does not uphold the home. In fact, it comes down with a crash. If you deconstruct a rock, you are left with nothing but sand. And I think that while there are many, many good questions and doubts and reasons that people have for exploring something like deconstruction, there is a potential for it to do far greater damage than we might realize at the beginning or the onset of this. Now I want to just pause for a moment and reflect, because I know some of you might be thinking this, like, what, are we not supposed to ask questions? Are we not supposed to have doubts about these authority figures when I've seen so many examples of people in authority abusing that position? Are we just supposed to put blind faith in these institutions again that didn't work out so well in the past? So what's going on here? Are we just supposed to fall in line and check our brains at the door and not think too hard about these things and just go along with whatever the authorities tell us? No, precisely the opposite. I think there are sorts of reasons that people might even use the word deconstruction to refer to their own journey of faith. I've got friends, close friends, and also acquaintances, and I've heard stories of a lot of people using this term, deconstruction, to talk about leaving the Christian faith, and every single one of them had good questions. Every single one of them had a deep and genuine desire to understand these troublesome parts that are all over our faith. It's not easy to understand these things. All of them have good questions, and all of those questions deserve to be taken seriously. What I want to propose is that there are two ways of dealing with these questions and with these doubts, and one of them is a lot more helpful than the other. One way of dealing with doubt, say you have questions about, can Christianity really be the only true religion? What about the other 4.5 billion people on the planet and what they believe? Don't they have something to say? How can we claim that following Jesus is the only way to go? This is a serious question, and it deserves to be taken seriously. Or say you've got a more personal struggle with, if God is all-loving and all-powerful, how come these horrible things are happening in my life? Why am I experiencing such suffering? Why are people that I see on the news experiencing such suffering? If God can fix it, why doesn't he? Or questions like, the church is supposed to preach acceptance and love, and yet I see all sorts of examples of people doing just the opposite. People who claim to be Christians being hateful and spiteful and exclusive. All of these questions deserve to be taken seriously. They should not be brushed aside to say, hey, no, don't think that way. Just stick with the program and we're going to be all good. Doing that's only going to take you down a path you don't want to go down. Don't think that way. Just follow the program. That way does not work well. And maybe some of you have been told that message before and realize that squashing something down, repressing questions or doubts, always just leads other things to spring up in their place. It doesn't deal with the problem itself. It just is dealing with the surface level symptom. What I want to propose is embracing doubt as an open curiosity. Open curiosity and a desire to understand. When you have these doubts or these questions and you address them and you face them with curiosity and a desire to know and a humility that you need in order to learn something new, you'll be approaching these doubts and these questions with what I want to call a geological perspective. A geologist is somebody who studies rocks, who pauses and takes time to look closely at rocks, at stones, at the bedrock, to understand, what kind of stone is this? What kind of rock is this? Pausing to look and does so with a team, with the community. Like, hey, look at this. I'm checking this out. I'm seeing this. Are you seeing this too? This geological approach to faith looks at the bedrock with a spirit of curiosity, wanting to know more, doing so with a community of other geologists, maybe more seasoned and more studied geologists who can help you understand what's going on. All of this is said that while also knowing you can study, you can slow down, you can examine, you can have people teach you, but at the end of the day, the geological approach will always also include faith. That this approach doesn't necessarily guarantee you will find conclusive answers to the questions that you have or the doubts that are stirred up within you. It's not a guarantee that those doubts will go away forever or that the questions will be conclusively answered in the way that you might want. But it is a way to do so as a community, to pause, to have curiosity and humility. And then at some point, make a step of faith, saying, I will put my foundation down here. That although I don't understand this rock in its entirety, this is where I'm going to trust that this will hold me up, that I can put my foundation on this rock, and that when the winds and the rains and the floods come, this will stand firm. Another approach that I don't think works quite as well with doubt and questions is the approach that Lyotard and Derrida brought up of deconstruction. I think that this approach often, instead of having a geological angle to it, has a bit more of a dynamite and jackhammer angle to it. Instead of trying to study and understand the rock as a whole, this approach often breaks down the rock, chips away at the rock until it becomes small enough that we can handle it, that we can control it, that we can look at it from all angles. And in doing so, you might be, thinking that you're understanding it more, but as you chip away and as you destroy this rock in order to understand it, what you're doing is eventually chipping away and eroding the very foundation that you need when the rains do come, when the floods come, when the winds come. Our anxiety, our worries which are genuine. Is this rock going to be able to sustain me? Is this rock really what people say it is? I don't know. What if it's not? This is a genuine and legitimate worry to have. But I think the wrong approach is to break it down to see what's inside. To say, is it really hot? Is it solid all the way through? Let's find out by chipping away at it. In doing so, you're destroying the very thing that you're going to need. To quote a very wise wizard from Middle-earth, he that breaks a thing to understand it has left the path of wisdom. I think Gandalf has some very wise words that apply to us in these situations. He that breaks a thing in order to understand it has left the path of wisdom. I understand that there are worries and questions, but I want to encourage a spirit of geology that pauses and examines and studies, rather than a spirit of deconstruction, which destroys in order to understand, but in doing so has torn down the very foundation that you will need when the winds come, when the rains come, when the floodwaters rise. Josh Porter was somebody who was ready to break the foundation of his faith. He was somebody who was raised in a fundamentalist, strict, conservative Christian family in the South. And he was somebody who was always a little bit edgy. He liked to be provocative. He liked to ask tough questions in church. He had this spirit in him that liked to push the limits. He liked to push limits. And I think this might be what drove him to get involved in the emo punk rock Christian music scene of the mid-2000s. He was in this band called Showbread. And it was in this band that he made amazing music that he loved. But while he was on tour, he began to have some doubts and some questions of his own. He began to push the limits while he was growing up. He began to push the limits to see how far they could go. He became disillusioned with Christianity. As he began continuing to push the limits again and again and again, disillusioned, seeing, I'm looking at what Christians are saying, and I'm looking at what's going on in American culture, and there seems to be this very strange mixture that's fueling support for this war in Iraq that I don't really agree with. And he just decided to wash his hands of it and be like, this is not for me. This is getting ugly. I don't want to have anything to do with this. And so as he deconstructed his faith, as he left his faith, he leaned even further into the nihilistic and dark themes that you find in a lot of this emo punk rock music that's going on during the time. And as he let go of his Christian faith, he embraced nihilism full on, which is this belief that essentially, in a nutshell, nothing really matters. Nihilism is essentially saying, there is nothing after death. When we die, and that's it. And eventually everything is going to come to an end as the sun expands and swallows the earth and the universe collapses into a black hole. This very dark and heavy kind of belief that nothing matters. Nothing matters. So why care about anything that's going on in your life right now? This kind of belief, coupled with his very intense and fluctuating lifestyle as a musician on the road, pushed him to the brink. As someone who likes to push the limits, he found himself about as far to the edge as he could go, to the point where he was considering taking his own life. And it was at this moment, when his house had been crashing down around him, as his life was about to come crashing down around him, that he found some security and refuge in the last place that he expected. In the words of the Orthodox creeds of the ancient church, he found comfort and hope and a place to stand in, of all places, the Nicene Creed. This is a man who had pushed himself about as far away from Christianity as he thought he could go. What he ended up doing was finding a foundation that had been there for nearly 1,700 years. This creed, this statement of the Christian faith that talks about who Jesus is. It's all about this creed came out of this ancient conversation within the church about who is Jesus. What is the nature of this person who is man and also God? It was in this ancient document that Josh Porter found a foundation where he could actually stand his feet instead of falling into the endless pit of nihilism. He found hope. He found a foundation. He found life. He found a way forward and a future. He's now a pastor of a church in Portland, and he recently just came out with a book called Death to Deconstruction. It's a very provocative name, but he's a very provocative and edgy person. But this was his story. That was his story of breaking down something, of leaving his foundation, only to find himself staring at an open pit and finding refuge and security and a sure place to stand in, of all places, the ancient creeds. I think this is the message of the gospel. This is the message that Christians have for the world. That, hey, I know what it's like to have my house come crashing down. I know what it's like to have a flood come and wipe away everything that I loved. But I found a better place to build. If your house has come crashing down, if your house was wiped out by this storm or this wind or the rain or the flood, follow me. I know where you can build and that won't happen again. I've built my house on this rock, and yes, storms have come and windows have broken. There has been property damage, but the house has stood because the foundation was firm, because the rock was solid, and it held the home up through everything that we've been through. It's like the old Christian hymn says, "My hope is built in nothing less than Jesus' love and righteousness. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand." Please pray with me. God, our rock, when we try to break you down, when we try to turn you into something understandable, God, we find ourselves on nothing but sand. We find ourselves on sinking sand. We find ourselves away from a foundation that can hold us up. Our foundation is not a foundation in our good works, a foundation of things that we've done to please you. Our foundation is just you and you alone. Our foundation is the works that Christ has done and the life that he offers to us. God, when we feel unstable, when floods come, when storms come, when our house comes crashing down, and may we find you as our secure place to stand, as a secure place to anchor our home and our lives, that we might be built up on something firm and solid. It takes faith, God, and we ask for that faith. We also ask that we can wrestle with our questions and our doubts within a loving and accepting community that knows what it's like to have these fears, to have these anxieties, and yet remains planted to this rock through faith. God, we pray for all of those who wrestle with doubts and questions. Every single one of us knows what that is like. There are many out there who have these questions and fears and doubts and don't know where to go. And we pray that we would be able to carry this message, that we have found a firm foundation, that we know where we can build our lives. And it's not guaranteed to be easy, that storms and floods still come, but you hold us up and hold us secure. You hold us steadfast. Amen.